I want to thank everybody for being here to come and learn about this project that I'm working with Texas A&M on. And you can see our logos down there at the bottom. Cecilia Giusti is a professor at Texas A&M in urban planning, urban design. Urban planning, okay. And Kim Mickelson is past president of Texas APA, just recently past president. And she is an attorney for the city of Houston. And we both have a wide variety of experiences on the border. I am a private landscape architect and planning consultant, so I work at all scales and many different project types, from small landscape architecture up to city comprehensive plans. And now this is my new large-scale project in this region analysis. So I also invited the White House to come. They said they're going to be here, but I think they caught wind of me saying something about, White House policy and HUI in the same sentence. And I don't know if y'all know what HUI is. It's a technical term. You do. You're from A&M. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started. So anyway, we're here to talk about the Texas-Mexico border specifically. We've had talks about expanding that out to the whole U.S.-Mexico border, but we're going to keep it tight for a while. We might expand out later on as the snowball keeps rolling and gets larger.
Mitch, can you maybe ask who else is from like other border states?
Oh, that's a good point. Do we have other border people here? Okay, in the back. U.S.-Mexico border or other ones?
Yeah. Other border? Huh?
San Diego, okay.
San Diego.
Cool. All right, very good, very good.
Where is it? Where is it?
Now,
Other borders in the world, like for example, where?
How about the rural west with a native Indian reservation border?
Yeah. that's
okay, okay.
Yeah, there's another one.
India and Pakistan, okay.
Yeah.
Go take a crack at K2. So we're going to keep this really informal. A lot of the presentations you've likely already seen are one person stands up, gives their speech, then they sit down, and the next one gets up and talks. And so we're going to be back and forth, in a more dynamic and fluid process. And this is a new project. It is, we still have a lot of analysis that we'll be going through, both in the academics and just my work as a practitioner, looking at all the issues and hearing from you. This is real important that we do hear back from you, your experiences, things you see that are awful, things you see that work well, so that we can keep expanding this knowledge base. And really the whole thing, and in terms of me, I started this discussion with A&M because, as I told Bruce Dvorak, that I wanted to kick up a little political dust, because I hate the idea of a border wall totally. And most of the border folks that I've talked with are on the same page. So, Cecilia, this is you.
So I just wanted to say also that, I work at A&M. I am a faculty there. I am associate dean in the College of Architecture right now. And we have been trying to promote ideas on how to make more inclusive societies, communities in general. And there we have a proposal of a wall, okay? And we have done, I am also part of the Latinos and Planning Division of APA. And we have the promotion of dialogues along the country. We had one in Brownsville, Texas, 3 years ago. Edna here was a student who helped me at that moment. And in the middle of all of this, somebody comes from practice and says, what is A&M doing about the border? And I was like, we are little things. And he comes, says, we need to make a more formal proposal, more formal narrative. And I said, yeah. We need somebody from the outside to bring it to the academia. And they said, we have to do it. And then pretty soon, Kim, who is at a jump faculty also at A&M, jumped into the discussion. And we are trying to promote like with a border lab. And I know other states have something equivalent, but in Texas, we do not have something like that. And the first thing we said is like, why can't we the academia and the practitioners from public sectors in the city of Houston and the private sector, can we propose a new narrative, a new way of understanding what is the border, and how can we propose a narrative that is not only like we are listening to the news today, and it's outrageous the way we talk about border issues without us having a voice, and we should promote to have a voice, and that's how we perceive this thing about. This is like amistad, really, it's a reservoir that is managed by both countries, U.S. and Mexico, and it's kind of an example of we can do it.
Right, and so it's built on the border, and this is actually at the border, crossing on the dam, we believe. And so,
Mitch,
you know-
Mitch, let me add just a couple of things. Just from jumping into this was an issue, and I confess it was a little politically motivated on my part, just as Mitch indicated that he invited the White House. As soon as Donald Trump was elected, I put out an email to the southmost section of the Texas chapter of the APA and said, who wants to talk about border issues? Because I think in the planning profession, we have an ethical obligation to consider inclusivity, equity issues, how decisions that are made at the political level affect the people, the movement of animals, the environment, and as Cecilia says, when Mitch contacted her about this proposal, it was like all of this just started coming together. So we've been meeting over the last few months to kind of talk about the issues in general and where we might go with these. Like Mitch says, we want your input and your ideas about it going forward, and how we can keep pursuing this as planners and moving the issues forward. They've really been involved in the on-the-ground work more so than I. So, you know, they've got the practical element. I've still got kind of the, you know, rosy-eyed Pollyanna idea that we should be doing something to fix this.
but a ton of
And
value
take-
to add in, I might say, so,
And take a proactive stance.
yes.
I mean, I really think planners need to stand up and
Yes,
take
sir.
a proactive.
have a position on the border law?
No.
We
Yeah.
can actually, at the end of this session, we can actually make a
Yeah.
proposal. What about that?
Yeah.
Okay?
But that's
Okay,
on our
but it's
list.
a very good idea.
Yeah.
This is something that we are discussing also, we
Yeah.
should. Now, she's the former president of Texas chapter of APA. We have somebody, that's why we wanted her here,
Yeah.
is the institutional support of this,
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we want
are
to
not
take
just-
those issues forward.
Yes.
They won't listen to me, but she's got credit, so. So, you know, it's like we may argue with our sibling, but we're still truly good friends. And so we do a lot of things. That past slide with the Lake Amistad, that's a joint project between the United States and Mexico. And I was reading a list that Cecilia sent me on various treaties all up and down the Texas-Mexico, United States-Mexico border, you know, where we have agreements, you know, on water policy or whatever it may be. So why do we treat it like an invading enemy? You know, it's ridiculous. And so we're challenging all of these notions. And I put this together as kind of this central thesis slide that we want to challenge the political strategy coming out of the Fed and coming out of Texas politics as well, and likely also New Mexico, California, Arizona. And we need to find alternatives, and we know that institutions like APA and our profession, this is really one of the great places to have this conversation and to really come up with ideas that work well and work great, because this is a strong place of social connectivity, you know, international social connectivity across border. You know, these cities know each other. You know, these countries know each other along the border. It's unique. It's got a unique culinary food agenda. It's unique in its music. It's unique even in its language with the colloquialisms and so forth.
Well, I wanted to include this slide that was created by Vara, who's here in the audience, my PhD student. But this is something that is also part of the narrative today. It's not just a border, any border. It's a border with Mexico. And it is also in the national discourse, this is portrayed as something like negative, so criminalized. And I wanted to showcase that, yes, where are Latinos living in the US? And this is the latest census, and the highest, the darker areas are where more Latinos are living, proportionally talking about. And also over it is the imposition of the border pre-1848. Okay, this was Mexico. So, and this is a kind of a cliche now. The people who live in this area, a lot of the people who live in this area lived there from before it was the US. We say the border crossed them, they didn't cross the border. So it is not by accident that it happens. So we need to contextualize what border between Mexico and the United States is about, okay? So that was why we have this. So we have put together a lot of different ideas to kind of provoke the conversation, okay? So that's more or less our approach today.
Right,
So
and
you go.
contextualizing with that slide, that's a powerful slide, and thank you, Bara, for putting that together. That's really awesome. So here, just kind of almost a restatement, is reaching out to you guys and all of us as planners, what can we do to contribute to the narrative of the border and to create a better condition for all of us. And in my belief, because it is such a unique and rich environmental region, it's also a very rich cultural and heritage region that it deserves to be a destination, like going to the Grand Canyon or going to some big, place that has a lot of unique characters. And so that's kind of, my position is it deserves to be, not treated as a redheaded stepchild or something where it gets slapped around and abused. And it's, because of the policies, it's, the economic strategies are really, have been depressed because of all the things we put on it. So this is a slide from another one of our partners on the project at A&M that I believe he said this was an agricultural map where the policy of checking for diseases coming in through the fruits and vegetables, that's the range where the checkpoints are. I'm going to run through these pretty quick because we do have a fair amount of slides just to give you some ecological context. There's elevations. Of course, the darker, the higher the elevations, and we're really moving out toward the west. It gets hotter, drier, more desert. Precipitation, the same thing. Watersheds, that's an important one in terms of the treaties that we have in conjunction with Mexico about water policy. There's a story where there was a water policy treaty done way back before agriculture was prominent along the Mexican side of the border. And as their industry grew in agriculture, then they needed a lot more water, and the United States wouldn't come to the table to negotiate with them. And so what they did is get my little pointer out here. Presidio is somewhere around up in here, and one of the major tributaries to the Rio Grande actually flows past Presidio from the Mexican side and feeds into the Rio Grande. And they said, okay, fine, so we'll dam up our river over here and deprive that water from even flowing into the Rio Grande. So a lot of that sort of discussion, it's the sibling fighting thing, that sort of stuff. Temperature, of course, it gets hotter. Land cover, just seeing where the vegetation is, in the higher elevations, the forest, and then the desert ecoregions. And then endangered species is another interesting topic. And I found it interesting that I think we have some gaps in our data because I'm pretty confident that species don't just stop right there at the river.
Yes. But I just
I'm a landscape
the whole
architect.
point of
I
the
know
whole
that
point
stuff.
of this set of slides is like the environment doesn't care about how we divide the countries, the watersheds, the patterns of temperature or issues like that of rivers do not care about this. So that's kind of the message here, no?
Yeah, our natural world doesn't really get involved in politics a whole lot. And I was going to say earlier at the beginning that, we started this conversation and a lot of other people have joined in to speak to us about it. And then all of a sudden we found ourselves signed up for 3 different conferences to speak on the topic. We had one the first part of last week, and we have this one right now, and then we're going to an international conference on borderland policy coming up in July. So these are, that was a landscape conference before, so a lot of this has some of that basis in there. You know, the landscape is quite elegant, and so these are all aerials from the Rio Grande, looking at the Rio Grande in different places. I love that one because, you know, the river has its history, and you can see the historic river and you can see the current river. And an interesting story, I'm competing for a project up in El Paso that's a mission trail project, and there's 3 missions south of El Paso, starting in El Paso and moving south. But earlier in the century, 2 of those missions were in the Mexican side, but there was a major flood. The river rerouted around the missions, and those missions became on the United States side. So this slide is kind of a, we're getting into a topic of the different cities. And so each of the urban centers up and down the Texas border has its sister city on the Mexican side. And so it's a real interesting fact to see that the Mexican cities have grown much faster. And most of that growth has been brought on by the actual border, you know, people migrating up to the north. And in conversations I've had in Eagle Pass, you're going to hear stories from Eagle Pass because I've consulted with that city on their master plan. And so I know a lot of them there, and I went down there to interview them specifically on border policy. But they were telling me that, you know, it's the northern Mexican residents aren't the ones that immigrate. It's Central Mexico and South Mexico, and then Central America and beyond that are the immigrants coming across because, you know, life is okay in northern Mexico. So that's kind of what that is. And that...
She keeps kicking me. Go ahead and finish.
You're not even siblings.
I know.
Okay, go ahead.
So I was going to add, I started my career as the planning and land use attorney in El Paso, which is what this is a photograph of. And you know, starting when you work along the border, you realize how much of that history, like the slide that Cecilia showed you, was, you know, really from the south north. And I hope there's nobody from Massachusetts in here, but forget the Pilgrims, because the first Thanksgiving was actually in El Paso. When Juan de Oñate came across the border and started the Camino Real up north. So, you know, that history and that integration across the river has just, you know, that's part of our history. That's not invasion or takeovers. It's a you know, it's a real important aspect of it that I think gets forgotten.
Right, and that makes this whole idea of a border kind of doesn't even make sense in a lot of ways in that regard, because it's a shared society. They all know each other.
Just where the river is.
Yeah, it's just
how
happening,
it-
well,
yeah.
just in that part.
In
even.
that area.
Yeah, just in that part even. And so I like the lines up there, you know, the vibrant cross-border economy, the century-old tradition of social integration and biculturalism. You know, that's so true. And we're looking at that last comment on the bottom that I mentioned was, you know, the Mexican cities have a lot more density, a lot more population than on the Texas side because of that migration to the northern border areas. And these are a series of slides that kind of demonstrate that. So here on the top you have Laredo, and below Nuevo Laredo,
Yeah.
and you can see visually it's a lot
And
more
just
dense.
to add, this is the information from the census data of the U.S. on the both cities on the border, okay? 90, 2000, and 2010, how much each of the cities, the sister cities, have grown by decade, okay? So you can see clearly what the images show. You can see in terms of a population also.
Right, and I think it's quite interesting to see that even the street grids match up, you know, from across the border. You know, here's another one. Let's see. McAllen Reynosa further down in the valley. This one, I think there, we have this gap here due to floodplains and valuable agricultural land that's big in their industry. But look at the density in Reynosa, you know, very dense. Here is Eagle Pass and its sister city, Piedras Negras. About a month ago, I was in Eagle Pass doing my interviews. There's the existing border right there. And it happened at a time with their Friendship Festival, which they do in conjunction with Piedras Negras. And they have a big parade that goes across the bridge and comes down. And I met the mayor of Piedras Negras, very nice lady. But she's hugging and glad handing all these people that come around. You know, it's just like a family reunion almost. They had the Border Patrol as part of the parade. They had Native Americans as part of the parade because there's a Kickapoo tribe there as well, their holdings. And those are the two vehicular pedestrian borders, and that's a railroad, which is another problem and another story. Brownsville, again, Matamoros, Tamaulipas.
The density is so obvious also there, no?
Roma and Ciudad Miguel Alemán. Roma is home to one of the World Birding Center. In fact, it's even marked, I hadn't even noticed that, but it's marked on there. And the next slide coming up, before I get to that, you can see the matched street grids. You know, it's just quite elegant to see city planning, you know, through history that is matched up in that way. But the World Birding Center is indicative of how fantastic the ecotourism, nature tourism is in that area. Birding tourism is quite popular and expanding dramatically as an economic tool, as a, you know, just a tourism tool. And so Roma's up here. Oops, wrong button. So, and I actually had a friend of mine that was one of the lead consultants on putting all of that together. So a lot of activity in terms of tourism already happening there at the border. Now, back in Eagle Pass, this is an aerial from the Colonia to the south, and I don't recall the name of it. The names are kind of mixed around in that area, you know, because they all kind of blend in together. But, you know, when you travel in medieval cities of Europe or in places, you know, places that come together in these interesting intersections are some of the most dramatic places that we see as travelers and as planners. And so right now, you know, a lot of these streets are dirt. They may not have a sewer. They may not have potable water. You know, there's very little in terms of any services. The city is compelled to give them police, fire, and I think trash service is also there. And so, you know, I just threw this in here, having had the benefit of traveling to Fez. You know, the street pattern in Fez is basically a medieval city and conscientiously put in a kind of a crazy pattern. And even the guidebooks tell you, you know, I haven't experienced Fez until you go into the souk and get lost. And that's an intentional thing. And so when you see these kinds of patterns, you know that really rich places could actually evolve out of these. It just needs the right economic stimulus packages to come in. So moving forward here. And that's just demonstrating some of the great heritage there, the food. The music is quite unique, the Native American heritage there. And so we put together this kind of as, you know, we're starting to try to do some mapping, right? So we needed to have something that we could tie this to. And so we use tacos. You know, we got different kinds of tacos that are all over the place. And of course, coming from Austin, we do have breakfast tacos. So, but it's kind of just having some fun with it, and it's just demonstrative of how interesting, you know, the culture is in there. This is a slide that shows the places where the border actually is. And so Texas, we're actually quite fortunate that we haven't had, you know, our whole alignment shackled with the border wall. And New Mexico, up here in Arizona, of course, you know, Arizona has the whole wall.
Yeah. And what this really points out to, Mitch, I don't know if you were going to get to this point, but jumping in a little bit is that, you know, along the border in Texas, you know, where the wall is built up on the, you know, kind of east and west, you know, ends of the state, then the other ones are all around the urban centers. And that was a very clear policy decision, because if you made it tough to cross the border in the city, then you had to go out into the desert. I mean, conditions are just worse, terrain or so forth, and weather, animals.
So Kim
Hunters.
also has another story. I don't know if you're bringing this up now, but Kim was there when in El Paso, this all started with the border wall. And so that's quite dramatic that, you know, it started there. And so when
when they shut down those kind of crossings and make it more difficult, and that was
In 92?
92, early 90s, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, they really undertook an effort to make border crossings more difficult in El Paso, between El Paso and Juarez, you know, in the urban core, and people who before had gone back and forth, you know, multiple times a day sometimes,
right.
and certainly during the week, suddenly couldn't get done. And there was a huge economic impact on both sides of the border. I mean, they were very, very reliant on one another, and it's just crazy.
We don't have a slide with that also, we should have, but there's the crossing is not just the people who come for once to immigrate in the US.
Right.
It's a daily labor
Right.
going back and forth. That's one of the things that many people don't get when we talk about crossing borders in these big, high pedestrian borders. It's like people actually work or study in any of
Right,
the side
right.
of the border. So this is an element that we missed the slide here, but
Right.
it is part of the culture, the practice, or the common behavior along the borders, okay?
I may have some rush hour photos in Eagle Pass for the school buses and the kids and the people coming across the border to work.
Tequila workers.
Yeah, like that's right. So, as Kim was talking about the borders along the urban edges, the assumption being, well, you know, if we make it difficult crossing in the city and it's a harsh environment on the outskirts, then they're just gonna stop coming. Well, that didn't happen. The immigration kept happening across the border, forcing them out into the deserts, and there was a real spike in deaths out in the deserts and in the hinterlands. And so this slide shows, just briefly, there's only one crossing right there that does not have a border fence. That's the only one that the research students were able to find. So a nice, ugly portrait of the border. And then throwing in a little humor, you know, what else can we do with this fence? You know, let's use it for
Skyward.
something.
Yeah, and this is an example, you all have probably heard in the press, that there's a lot of property owners, you know, ranchers down along the Texas border, you know, actually have built way stations that they keep stocked with food and water for people who are now not going through the urban centers, they're going out in the desert. They don't want them dying on their land.
That's right.
And, you know, there are a lot of property owners down there who are protesting. One wealthy Republican donor even stopping making donations to the Republican Party because of this proposal. So, you know, it's not uniformly liked along the region.
Right, and one of the stories that I read was a border patrol coming, you know, passing people on a trail, following this path of water and food stationed out, and seeing the water bottles punctured by the, you know, by the border patrol that they just passed because it was water they just put out. So,
There's another issue also in terms of the wall, is that it had to condemn property. And it depended on the wealth of the ranchers, how much they have been obtained by the federal government being paid for them. So it is a big inequality in the prices they have gotten, if you can hire some legal advice or not. So that's an issue of fairness, and there's lawsuits going on about the price paid to expropriate the properties, okay? So that's part of the actual construction of this small purchase of walls around. It could be fences, really.
so again, poking a little fun at the wall with this slide, you know, getting teeter-totters and stuff. But I told when I was discussing the wall with the mayor, the fence with the mayor, I was like, Mayor, what we can do is we can slice this thing horizontally, right that, you know, get it out of the view of the river, and then we can fence off your elementary schools. So we've run across a significant amount of research from a variety of sources that are basically saying that all the hype about, you know, murder rates and crime and everything is just not happening at the border. Eagle Pass is actually quite quiet. It's a very sleepy, kind of friendly town. Everybody's very friendly. Our political allies are not, you know, locking hands like you see there. This story right here is quite interesting. Cactus, Texas, and a lot of irony as well. So, Cactus is a little small town in the panhandle of Texas, and it has one major employer of a meatpacking plant. and most of the workers in that factory were actually immigrants, undocumented, thank you. Because I used a different word and I was corrected. So most of their staff was undocumented workers. And when I swept in, they rounded up 1,200 or 1,300 undocumented workers out of the whole Cactus town, most of which worked for the factory, for the meatpacking plant. So as this indicates up here, you know, they thought that the American workers were going to just come in and soak up all those jobs, but they didn't. So the meatpacking plant was faced with closing. You know, they produce meats for Walmart and for HEB and for all the major vendors. And they scratched their heads, they went around, and they did find another immigrant group from Somalia, from Pakistan, and from other countries. And so they reinforced themselves with basically a Muslim population. And very quickly it became the 15th most populous per capita population of Muslims in the entire country for a short period of time.
Yeah, I love the irony.
The irony is just crazy, you know. This is
You don't know what you're asking for.
yeah. And they were awesome workers. This is a new map, 2017 map of the proposed border wall down in the valley. I think this is the McAllen. And it's basically graded on easy, moderate, and hard. Hard being both condemnation, because they, as Kim was saying, they have to take the land, and terrain. And of course, you've all heard that we're having this discussion about renegotiating NAFTA. It needs to be updated because of digital technology. And this is really kind of our window of time to talk about these issues and try to get policy in place that's much more important for you know, the life and times of the border. And related to NAFTA, I-35, which is the north-south corridor coming all the way through the United States, is actually the Pan American Highway. So it starts up in Canada and goes all the way down to Tierra del Fuego, right?
To Santiago, Chile.
Santiago.
Tierra del Fuego, yes.
Tierra del Fuego, and the tip of Chile. So I don't know, how many miles is that? Is that
A lot.
6,000 miles? So huge corridor. So I'm going to read this. U.S.-Mexico border with 22 million inhabitants, 300 billion in gross domestic product, 100 billion in trade, and a unique history and culture. In 1995, it witnessed some 225 million legal frontier crossings each way, and this is to Cecilia's point, mostly Mexican shoppers who spent $22 billion in the United States, paid $1.7 billion in taxes, and generated 400,000 jobs, but received no services. And this is kind of the key point right here. Balanced against the cost of Mexican illegals, American taxpayers made a 600% profit. You know, what do you hear in the news? You hear about, oh, they're coming across, they're, you know, having babies, they're getting medical attention, they're skipping their bills at the hospital. You're not hearing this in the news at all. All right.
And if any of you have studied NAFTA and the development that happened after it was passed, I mean, the growth on both sides of the borders was phenomenal. I know being in El Paso when that was passed, you know, we saw a huge amount of growth and development. Yes, you know, a lot of the plants were in Juarez or outside of Juarez, but, you know, the development that we saw, again, from Mexican nationals coming across to shop, to build second homes, to bring money there was really a huge impact on the economy, obviously on both sides.
The point we wanted to emphasize is that we showed before also the data on crime, that is not terribly higher on the border, first. Second, it is not that we or the U.S. is subsidizing this immigration process. No. Analysis, one after the other, show how much is not exactly that the case. And we have to make that narrative more in the open, and that's one of the objectives of this discussion.
Okay. Ethics.
Ethics.
Ethics. Okay, ethics actually.
Let's talk ethics.
Well,
You didn't know you were gonna get ethics this time.
Yeah.
this is not like a class of ethics, but this is from the APA Code of Ethics. And I took all the principles to which we aspire, and there in red are the two ones that I want to emphasize here. And it says, we shall give people the opportunity to have a meaningful impact on the development of plans and programs that may affect them. Participation should be broad enough to include those who lack formal organization of influence. And we shall seek social justice by working to expand choice and opportunity for all persons, recognizing a special responsibility to plan for the needs of the disadvantaged and to promote racial and economic integration. We shall urge the alteration of policies, institutions, and decisions that oppose such needs. This is such a powerful code of ethics that I haven't proposed personally. It's the APA who does it. So we have to remind ourselves, what are we as APA planners are doing to adjust to this code of ethics along the border? And that's how we're gonna proceed now.
So you know what that means?
You're next.
No, that means that all the planners that are working under the current political idea about border policy, they're all gonna get written up on code violations.
Oh, that's good.
That's honestly an interesting concept. So I did a study a few years ago of code of ethic complaints at APA. Okay, I come from a really regulated profession in the law. Every month in the Bar Journal, there's like 12 pages of disciplinary actions against lawyers. I think in the last, I forget what time frame I looked at, but in 10 years, there were like 6 ethics charges lodged with 6, single digit, against AICP members of the profession. But you have to ask yourself this, what if, and this is always kind of the rub, you're a member of a legislative staff or a federal agency whose job is building this wall or promoting this wall or promoting the rewrite of NAFTA or other various policies. What do you as a planner do when you still have to pay student loans or pay your mortgage or what have you? Then, where does the rub between that come? And that's a real, it's a real ethical dilemma. Planners face it every day. We're going to talk about real cases.
Right. So
Yeah.
Cecilia, you have
So
ongoing stuff.
What we try to do now is I was kind of thinking about the border. What are things that are working? Or what are the things that we can look at that are positive, that can actually show us ways that we can take things on our hands, or communities are doing that. So we have the Lake Amistad, which is a binational project that I talked before, is an actual co-managed water area that is right now used for tourism purposes, and is working, okay? Now, this is an old project. There's a new proposal in El Paso, Juarez, that instead of a wall, why not a binational border bike share? And it passed. And it was interesting. It has not been done yet, but it's something that is still going on, okay? So I thought it was a very powerful statement, and I really applaud it. I am not part of that, but I applaud it.
Yeah, and Kim, you said that El Paso has,
Yeah.
Hitting your foot. So is anyone here from El Paso? I didn't see
So we
anybody
can
right
talk
away.
this
Yeah, we can talk about El Paso. Okay.
good that we can lie.
Yeah. So, how many of you have heard about the El Paso Juarez streetcar project? Okay, I am obsessed with this project. A El Paso resident went to, I believe, NYU for his master's in fine arts, came back to El Paso to really complete his final project. And he started, I call this kind of subversive planning. But he started by putting up, he's a fine arts major, right? So he starts by putting up these posters, kind of retro looking, that say, take the streetcar to Juarez. Cross the border today in the streetcar. And they're all kind of, 40s, 50s looking pictures and so forth. Everybody starts talking about it. They say, wow, this is cool. Can we go to Juarez on this? Who knew? Well, these streetcars have been decommissioned back in the 50s or 60s. They had been stored out in the desert, so they are rust-free, and, because it's really dry out there, right? And so they've been sent off to, I believe, Philadelphia, for refurbishing. And in talking with with the head of the West Texas section the other night at dinner, he says the first one is due back. This art student went on to get elected to city council. So they started this project for real, and they found federal funding and did all this. So streetcars are being refurbished. The first one's supposed to be back this summer, and it's supposed to open by this fall. It was a little delayed because of some funding crises. But again, it's another example of this cross-cooperation. This guy's not a planner. I think we ought to give him an honorary designation, frankly, but because I think it's a great idea, and it's, to me, that kind of project of, how do you encourage that relationship and that cross-border working together? I love it.
The other case I wanted to talk about that I thought it was very positive is El Cenizo. El Cenizo was a colonia. Colonia meaning a neighborhood with low income, substandard housing, correct? Now, they decided that they were not ever heard at any level. They became a city, and they decided to become a city. So,
Incorporated into a city.
yeah, they did all the paperwork. Can you move it, please?
Next one.
Oh, next slide. Okay, I thought you.
So what is very interesting about El Cenizo, and I did a research project in El Cenizo. So I met Mr. Reyes, who in 2004 was selected the youngest mayor in the U.S. at
This
21
gentleman
years
right
old.
here.
He's here. And it is interesting because, he was the youngest. He was part-time student, part-time mayor, because there was not enough funding for a full-time. It was a part-time one, 2 commissioners, okay? But the interesting thing is that in 2006, the city of El Cenizo, which has 99.9 people who are from Mexican immigrant heritage, and 99.9% speak Spanish, decided to pass an ordinance to conduct all public meetings in Spanish. And it was so controversial. It was in the national news and everything. And it was so logic. Not only that, they passed an ordinance that on not checking immigration paper on anybody, which was also controversial. But they actually are very progressive in their approach. Would you please, the next one?
Right. And
And,
the mayor's been very popular.
And has been elected for the 3rd time already. So 3rd term, sorry.
Yeah.
And so they have, because of that, and the lesson is not just they elected a mayor or things like that, but they have been able to take their future in their own hands by local organizing themselves. And that's what is interesting. They got money because they are now sitting in the table of mayors in Texas, in the US, and they have paved roads, sidewalks, street lighting, and they started a $1.6 million storm drainage project. Anyway, they have a process of building now a first public library in the city. So it's kind of a success story, but still they are a low-income community, okay? It's not like they became like the new whatever. It's still a low-income community, well-organized.
Right, and I guess we should say that a colonia in its formation is basically a landowner starts to carve up lots informally.
The next one will
And-
be about it.
Oh, is that?
Yes,
Okay.
the next one. It is as an issue, but the next
Okay.
case I wanted to talk about is Las Lomas, which is, can
Oh.
you go?
Yeah.
Las Lomas is another success story. They didn't become a city. You don't have to become a city, but it's a typical case. The colonias were formed because somebody who is the owner of one big ranch divides, sells the land as it is, with no platting, with no anything done, infrastructure less. But they sell because there is a shortage of housing in the area. Of all the economic activity doesn't come along with housing supply, affordable housing. So what is interesting is that they partition, there's land tenure problems, they went through contract for deed instead of an actual mortgage. And so there were a lot of irregularities. And there's another element that I also learned, I did a research on this area also. And this because immigrants from Mexico who have gone out many times due to corrupted governments and a corruption system, come to the U.S. expecting a more fair system. And can you go back on the next one, please? What is interesting here is a lot of the land in this area specifically was owned by a local judge who really, really was very corrupted. He ended up in jail. It's a nice story, okay? However, it took
Karma.
it took the Las Lomas residents to organize themselves. And they even made a march from Las Lomas, south of Texas, Stark County, up to Austin, Texas, where the capital is, the central capital of Austin. And indeed, they won their case. There was a receivership formed because of that, and then there has a plotting. Can you go to the next one, I think? They organize themselves as Colonias Unidas. That is something that a local grassroots organization, and they really took upon themselves, and they won their case. And they made the case, and the county, the judge was jailed. And it's a kind of a nice story. And through that moment, through that process, actual leaders became very relevant. That started like asking in the Colonias Unidas for water and sewage became a more political statement. So my point here being is that there are many positive stories that are telling the capacity of the people in the area to organize and claim for themselves.
I'll add real quickly that I think the issue of colonias pulls up some other issues that planners within cities along the border areas need to keep in mind. You know, generally the practices that these colonias end up developing out in the county, where the city may or may not enforce their subdivision regulations, or the county may not have or enforce subdivision regulations. The legislature's tried to address that by making border counties adopt minimum subdivision regulation standards in order to get state funding. But still this has happened, so it becomes a knowledge and enforcement issue. How far do you push your city attorney to go after these illegal subdividers? There have been some subsequent changes about using contracts for deeds and making those illegal. But again, these things still happen. They fly under the radar, and this goes on. But as planners in the city, annexation policies sometimes prohibit, or it makes it prohibitively expensive to annex these areas into the city because they don't meet standards. And to bring them up to standards is going to take a lot of funding to do that. And so it's just kind of perpetuated itself. I know that was an issue when we were in El Paso, and you know, it's still there for a lot of areas along the border.
Right, and as most of you know, in annexation law, once a city annexes out an area, they have an obligation and a requirement
Right.
to extend those services.
Yeah, it's got to get done.
Got to get done under a certain amount of time.
Yep.
This is more or less about the same
Yeah.
thing.
Oh, yeah.
It's like when you actually do subdivide your land instead of doing the proper preparation of the land, you will get a lot of, next one please. In this case, this is one of in the Stark County was Alto Bonito, that is next to Las Lomas. This was one of the cases. This is the colonia that is there, and there's a river around. So really, because it's so much dry along the area, it will be dry, but then rain happens once in a while, and everything is flooded. So there was a need to, and this is part of one research partnership we got into with UT Austin, the Colonias program where I work, and the University of Wisconsin that had a wonderful land tenure center who really made us possible to research these areas.
We lost our stuff off the bottom there, our credits.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
There's
Well, finally, one other interesting thing that we are promoting also that was an initiative of the Latinos and Planning Division of the APA is along with the dialogues, we did a dialogue on the border that allow us, and then I left, but we got an APA State of Texas Award for Best Project in the border, and it's an idea to listen, to engage, and ways in which we do it, it was very effective. And that is it.
So,
So now-
so now we're gonna get back to some Eagle Pass stories, since I'd worked there and had a very interesting time. And it's really my first introduction to the border fence. And so that's where this all started for me is, I was working with Eagle Pass and I'm starting to understand the economics, the social context, the relationships, and how depressed their economy is, quite frankly. And so this is that same colonia to the south, and it's in dire need of work, in dire need of an economic stimulus package. So I put together a proposal for Eagle Pass. The chamber president in one of my interviews said that, what we really want to see come to Eagle Pass is a really nice high-end or nice class RV park for tourism, because there's nothing like that around here. And so that stuck in my mind, and when I was driving around and doing my assessments like I do, I came across this patch of land that's really kind of in all of this is colonia, all of it. Actually, it's like 3 different ones that have merged together. And so this little patch of land, obviously it's a drainage thing, but that was a big patch of what, I was thinking parkland, right off the bat, to try to do something with trails and parkland enhancements and so forth. The city had recently built a big loop that went all the way around the city, and it comes in right here to the terminals of the international crossings. And I was like, aha, we can come in here and put an RV park up in these upper reaches and, get it positioned appropriately for, so it doesn't have a flooding problem. But we have a lot of housing also in here that's, substandard, of course, doesn't have the services. So this proposal speaks about acquiring this property from, the one owner that actually owns the land and rebuilding or building new housing for the folks that are in that zone within that blue box, and then hiring as many of those that would like employment right there on the site, bring them as the employment base for the RV park, and have an on-site housing for them. Adjacent to it is the school, and this proposal talks about having a community policing station and all of that, because there still is that stigma of colonias being the hotbed of corruption and gang activity and illegal drug trade. And I'm sure some of that is probably the truth. But I'm sure also that the majority of the residents there are quite benign and peaceful and just, want to live, raise their families, and work. So the other economic strategy moving out of the colonias and into the city was looking at downtown, and it I had this flash. It's like, gee whiz, Eagle Pass is a river city. And so there's not too many river cities that don't take advantage of their river as a great asset that they leverage for economic development and tourism and, to animate and enliven their downtown areas. This basically is the backside of the main commercial corridor in Eagle Pass. In taking this photograph, I have the river behind me. I also have the fence behind me, the border fence of that, like that inset picture. And this is all just flea market land. You can see Pulga, that's how they call their flea markets. And it's just a wasteland of trashed cars and junk and all sorts of things. Now, it's also in that lower level of land that's considered that kind of secondary floodplain area. So the commercial street on the other side of these buildings that elevation is actually right up here. And so I put together a proposal for them. This is that same stretch of land. This is the border fence right there. Okay, this is all their major sports parks fields right here. Border Patrol always sits right here in that little parking lot. And this is their festival ground. This is where they set up the carnival. This is where they do all the stuff. This light blue shading is that back of the commercial buildings. That's the main commercial street. It's actually what it's called. And so the residents from Piedras Negras come across every morning walking and they come right up here and they come down Commercial Street and they do all their shopping. And so, you know, I was talking with the mayor. So, Mayor, what we need to do is we need to build a boardwalk along this whole backside, all this right here. Do a nice boardwalk right here at the level of Commercial Street. You know, I'm always thinking ADA because I have to. And then below it, you know, it can be a whole new parking structure because everybody's complaining about not having enough parking spaces, which is funny coming from Austin where there aren't any. And I said, you know, this would be great. You can watch the soccer tournaments and the sports, you know, when it's carnival time, all this activity. You know, new restaurants can come in, take advantage of this, sit out, watch the sunset because it faces to the west. You know, have your umbrella drinks and really be a cool place and really animate the downtown. And but what we need to do is we need to remove about 1,000 feet of this border fence right there. And then that's where that story about cutting it in half horizontally and fencing off his elementary schools came in. And he looked at me, his eyes rolled back, and he's like, you know, we fought the federal government. They spent $1.5 million in the courts fighting that fence going in and lost. And they call it the Dick Cheney media event, actually, is when they installed that thing. And so he, you know, he's like, you know, don't do anything with this right now. I got to check to see if they still have pending litigation, you know, in the federal courts. And so nothing ever happened with that. But imagine if it could have happened. You know, the whole transformation of that whole zone right there would have been fantastic. One of the things we were looking at doing was, you know, when you have a redevelopment type of strategy like that, you know, one of the tools to help fund that could be a tourist district. So you start to see improvements in that area, and then you can start to do things like fixing downtown, the streets, the lights, the furniture, the trees. You know, maybe you have facade grants and those kinds of things, or maybe you get some money out to the colonias, you know, depending upon the structure of the TERS and how it's done. So we got to talking and we think, well, we need to think about a new zone. We need to think about a new formation of what this border could be like. Maybe it becomes an area that is actually an international zone, or maybe a denationalized zone is a term that I use. And actually, I thought I was so clever coming up with denationalized zone, but then I found it in the literature. So I thought that was kind of funny. It's like, dang it. So, as you've seen in the other maps, you know, these are the urban places along the border where you saw those little smidgens of border wall going up. And then we have, you know, the Big Bend area. If you're not familiar with Texas, fantastic natural resource and national park. We already have, you know, 20 miles into the United States and 20 miles, 30 kilometers, I think, into Mexico, border check stations. That's already an infrastructure that's there on the ground now. They got big batteries of cameras. They take your picture 1,000 different ways as you go through there. You know, the dogs sniff your cars. And so we think that, you know, does this line need to be the entire border of a denationalized zone or an international zone? And so what I'd like to do with that zone, and this is where, you know, the research has, you know, it's a tip of the iceberg is what we're talking about here. There's a whole lot of research that has to be done, a whole lot of discussions, people on the ground at the border, you know, policy folks at the cities along the border. But maybe we can talk the United States government to partner with the Mexican government to fund an enterprise zone in the urban areas to attract manufacturing jobs, to enhance the maquiladoras that are on the Mexican side, bring industry in. And what if we could piggyback on top of that with tourist districts, right? And capture that increment that we get out of the new boom in economic activity and start to rebuild those cities as well, because they are all in desperate need of funding for, you know, their infrastructure and their buildings and so forth. That's one of the depressing things about Eagle Pass is you drive through that city, and I drove every every street in that city, but 28,000 people. They have a magnificent stock of architectural heritage, historic buildings from the 1880s all the way, through the decades. Beautiful buildings. All of them are crumbling. Every one of them are falling down. Some of them are boarded up. Some of them are occupied. The stoops are all cracking, paint's peeling off the walls. Beautiful mansions, all falling apart. So it's very depressing to see that. And so we want to capture money and get it back into these cities and start to improve these cities and give them a sense of pride back. And then this last slide is like, well, maybe these zones are only the urban centers where we know we can do the manufacturing, we know the workforce is there, both in the cities and in the colonias. But what about smuggling? You hear about the illegal drug trade, you hear about the human trafficking, all the scare stories that you hear in the news about that. Well, it occurred to me after I've been writing about this idea and all the ideas that kind of flow off of it, is that is an industry of a person in Mexico or in the United States getting paid large amounts of money to smuggle stuff across the border, whether it's drugs or people. And you hear all those stories, the person that's walked up from Central America and finally, gets escorted across the border at the cost of maybe $7,000 and then abandoned off into the desert. That story is over and over and over again, and the spike in deaths, all the statistics about that. But that industry of smuggling, well, let me back up. So when the Fed said, okay, we're going to border off the urban centers, okay, pushing all the immigration to the outside areas, all right, that made the challenge of that much more dramatic. So guess what? The price goes up. It's normal economics, okay? So what may have been a $2,000 deal back when it was before the fence, now is a $7,000 or $8,000 deal to get across the border, and hopefully you're not, abandoned out in the desert without food and water or clothing. And so because it became such a lucrative business, some of the literature I've already read says that the drug cartels and the gangs have taken over that industry, okay? So that's really a problem. But if you have a zone that is now an international zone or a denationalized zone, the families can move and live there together. A family may be split apart, mom and dad is shipped across the border to the south, kids are left in the United States because they were born there, and those families are destroyed, essentially. Now they can live in that zone without the problems of visas and nationalities and so forth. So I think it's a very powerful thing that could happen that basically disables that whole industry of smuggling across the border. It's not going to get rid of it, but in large part, it could really hinder that idea.
10 minutes.
Yeah, so just very briefly, in digging into that whole idea of nationality, I ran across a UN paper that makes this statement about citizenship and nation-state citizenship, which we all think about, I'm a U.S. citizen, or the citizenship of human rights. And so there's now, I've stumbled upon this is a research deal. This is a discussion that's going on. Is nation-state citizenship an idea that's kind of aged out of its time? So that really is our presentation. There's a lot of questions, a lot of research to be done, and we really want to hear from you guys, your questions, your thoughts, the challenges you see, everything. So thank you all very much. We have a microphone. I have no idea if that's on over there, but if anybody's got anything they want to talk about, come on up.
We do have a couple of ideas for some next steps, and so particularly we'd like to hear from you all about ideas for border conferences or other issues at conferences on border issues. I've made some preliminary discussions with California, Arizona, New Mexico chapter presidents about doing a border conference. specifically. Don't forget, okay, we're in San Francisco next year, but don't forget, we're in Texas and Houston in 2020. We're very excited. But, you know, to me, that's a great opportunity too. The other one is,
Yeah.
I'll let
We-
Cecilia talk about the
we
survey.
have, because I have to do everything documented, we prepare a little survey to see what people on the border actually think about the wall and what is happening right now. And we are thinking on sending this survey to people along the border. And I made 50 copies, and I want you to look at these questions and tell me what do you think. And if you can make proposal of some changes, or is it unfeasible, what do you think about this? I'm gonna pass it around.
Yeah, and I think you said you had about 50 of them there, and so the idea is if we could send the survey to the cities, and a lot of those cities have subscriptions to SurveyMonkey, that they can post on their city websites and get feedback from their general populations. So here is an exercise where you guys can help us out by sharpening the questions. Some of the questions, we've changed the language on them several times, quite honestly. So
And
please
the
contribute
idea-
in that fashion.
And the idea too is that, you know, it's easy to just assume that everybody along the border is opposed to the wall and to what it will bring, but we found that isn't true. I think it was El Cenizo, the young mayor is in favor of the wall. So,
Right,
you know,
which he said in his NPR interview, which I
Right.
thought was very
yeah,
peculiar.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Questions, comments? Yes.
Hi, my name is Ruth Krager, and I work in Washington, D.C., so I have to deal with the administration quite a bit. I'm just wondering if you have had conversations or are thinking of having conversations with the advocacy arm of APA and what that's looked like and how we're going to motivate ourselves to advocate for these issues, even those of us who don't live in a border state.
Yeah,
But-
thank you.
So you're from the White House? You don't have a gold comb
The White House
over?
did show up. Well, no, let me answer her question real quick if I can. So advocacy was my big issue, and I'm still on the CPC Advocacy and Policy Committee and the Legislative Policy Committee. And I know the question was asked earlier about whether APA has a position on this, and no, they do not, but I agree that, yes, we ought to take something forward, and I'm happy to do that. And yeah, I think putting something out through the Planners Action Network, PAN, is everybody a member? Advocacy's a big deal, remember?
Yeah, and I
Please
also.
join and
Yeah.
be prepared.
But I
for-
also think that divisions could be important.
Yeah.
There is the international division, we have the Latinos and Planning division. There are different divisions that could
Small,
actually,
rural.
small and rural. I think it should be, a concerted effort. It's not just one person who does it. It has to be more from the bottom to the up, no?
Yeah. Chelsea?
Hi, I'm from Nebraska. So I lived in Germany for 3 years on and off, and we all know the history of Germany and the Berlin Wall. And I did live in Berlin with a host family that my host father did work for the Stasi and was almost put in prison for refusing to carry out dangerous orders, i.e. shooting someone on the wall. And so within that time frame of Berlin, Berlin is a huge home to about 400,000 refugees, and Germany almost a million. And so I did volunteer at a refugee camp in Tempelhof, and there is a huge opportunity there to hear out refugees, because this refugee crisis in Germany between Germans and Syrians is blurring the lines of borders very quickly. And regardless what you think, if it's a good thing or a bad thing, there's an opportunity there, not to create a new nation or anything, scandalous or outrageous, but to hear out people who have had years of experience living in another country, and we could go into the whole demographics and social side of the multi-generational immigrant families that are still not citizens because of the hardships there. And so I guess I just wanted to know if you could speak a bit more to bridging that gap. I know that's your whole plan, is to kind of bridge that gap between the border, but to also, I guess, invite that conversation more, because it's so hard to have the conversation of, these are people, not just numbers, and they do have a voice, and they do want things, and not, just to feed off of another government. That's not it at all.
Absolutely.
Right.
So I know you have a wealth of knowledge on the topic, and so I was hoping to hear you speak to that, and how to, I guess, elevate those people who have the quietest voice thus far.
Yeah. That was the
Right,
whole
thank
point
you.
of bringing, thank you very much, because it's very moving. I mean, that's why we went to the basics and talk about the code of ethics, because at the end, bottom line is we are humans. And regardless where you were born, what the color of your skin, if you have an accent or you don't have an accent, you are a human as you are, as I am, as everybody is. And we should treat everybody in that way. As, now, you wanted to say something about the war, or?
Yes.
Okay, well, I was telling them the story before we started. I grew up in Germany in the Cold War era, so I know of which you speak, and, yeah.
All right. Next.
It's just kind of short. My question has to do with the Native American tribe that is located in Eagle Pass. Have you engaged them in this planning process, in these discussions about the border wall? And forgive me for not knowing exactly, like, I would take it that because their land is trust land, that with a border wall, the federal government still has a say-so, and maybe they don't have the same rights. But my question is, have you engaged the Kickapoo in this discussion?
We haven't yet directly,
But
unless
they
you have.
have to, I mean, but we are starting, we haven't engaged so many people yet. We are starting on these ideas. But of course, we have read a lot, I have read a lot about it specifically. There's this Indian population that shares right now borders with Mexico, and they have binational treaties about to allow them to maintain it. And how is it going to be with the wall? They oppose the wall. There's still going on. But of course we have to. Yes. Bottom line, yes. And we have to. And A&M, we are like right now very much into working also with indigenous populations in the U.S. And there's a new faculty member who's now engaged in this work. So we are very aware of that. Thank you.
I was just curious.
Thank you.
If y'all had yet.
That'll be
Good.
some really interesting issues, too.
Oh, yeah. Some tough ones. Yeah.
That's a different
Well,
layer.
and Ramiro from the border, Brownsville, yes.
Ramiro Gonzalez, Brownsville, Texas. I really enjoyed your presentation. I really think it needs, as a critique to the presentation, and I think Cecilia and I we can talk about it, is it needs that local representation.
Absolutely.
In the sense
Yes.
that you need that border voice
Yeah.
to carry it,
Please
to carry
come.
it further.
We're
So I
gonna
could
go there.
technically, I mean, I'm there. That's what I do. I'm in Brownsville, so I'll volunteer myself.
So-
There are some efforts
Yes.
that are not covered in that. You talked about that binational zone.
Right, sure.
The Valley had a thing called, for a while, I don't know where it's at now, but a binational economic development zone. And it went pretty far. They started having conversations with the administration, not this
El
one.
Paso has one of those as well.
Yeah, so anyways, I think there's,
Right.
that local voice is missing, but we could be it, and,
Yeah.
we know a lot of other people
Yep.
that are on the border. Not a lot of people are here, but surprisingly, but anyways.
But really what we intend to do is to
Yeah.
start the conversation.
Yeah.
It has to start.
No, I'm glad.
And also, I see there's a lot of isolated cases that they don't talk to each other necessarily. And that
Yeah.
was.
Or a lot of smaller communities don't have planners.
I know,
Yeah,
yes, exactly.
That's true. That's another one,
true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Only the bigger communities have planners, so.
And we need
And we
voices.
welcome Ramiro, we welcome you, of course.
And we need voices that are not just United States voices. We need the Mexican voices as well. So we've tentatively or have attempted to reach out to the Tech University of Monterey But we haven't made a solid communication on this topic yet.
Hi, Jim Sussex from Seattle, and I really like the story about the streetcar in El Paso, and that
Yeah, I love that, yeah.
So cool.
dawns on me that that's not an example of, not just an example of tactical urbanism, but tactical transnationalism.
Yes, yes, yes,
So-
yes, 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 yes,
I
Yeah.
think that's something you should really try to feature.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly,
somewhat.
exactly.
Yeah.
My question has to do with the broader context of NAFTA negotiations. I mean, we think of it strictly in economic terms, but when it was passed, it came with side agreements and the formation of the North American Commission for Environmental Cooperation, which has a funding process, and I don't know how active it is now, but it was expressly to deal with instances where there was some kind of disadvantage for one country versus another, including Canada, as a result of the globalization process that NAFTA represented. I'm wondering if you've engaged with that at all through the Commission or the JPAC or the other mechanisms that were created as part of that side agreement, and is there some role of advocating for the strengthening of those mechanisms even though I'm sure it would be an incredibly uphill battle, the context of the future negotiations for quote-unquote improvements to NAFTA that our president is advocating for?
Mm-hmm. I can't speak to that.
can't,
Yeah, but I did have local
That's-
conversations in Eagle Pass, and NAFTA is kind of a love-hate thing with them. You know, they love some aspects of it, and if it went away, they would hate that those things that they did like actually went away as well. So it's an interesting conversation, just as NAFTA.
As we said before, we are trying to, there's many different aspects of this conversation, this discussion. We started from one place. And we know that there are some research centers that are also working in different places on border issues. So we're very aware. But that is a very relevant point. NAFTA, and this is right now being negotiated or not negotiated. It's still in the limbo. You know what is happening. We don't have a voice there, if that was a question. I wish I had, but I don't have a voice in the negotiation. I am not represented there, let's say, okay?
And that's part of the value of our questions here, is because we have a research agenda that's really kind of on steroids, because we got to get prepared for another conference, and we need to have these kinds of questions and challenges. Yes, sir.
You did not mention Homeland Security, HUD, Department of the Interior. Is that on
Yes.
purpose?
Not at all on
No,
No,
purpose.
we just
no.
haven't quite covered those yet.
No,
in
it's
the
like
research.
Yeah.
They'll be
We know that, yeah.
Yeah.
there's
Absolutely.
issues.
The Border Patrol are actually very welcome in Eagle Pass. And according to my friend, the Main Street manager there, he's like, we like Border Patrol. They come in with their families shop, they actually go downtown and seek out the restaurants. They are part of the community, they're featured in the parade, celebrated. It was quite interesting, because that's not, I've been reading quite a bit, as you can imagine, and that's not in the literature, how much the
Yeah.
communities actually embrace their Border Patrol.
In the dialogue, for example, that we had in Brownsville, where Ramiro was there, the consul from Mexico came, and he did an opening speech. We try to always integrate. That should be always like that. So we don't have anything in any of the departments, should be the text, US DOT, transportation, health, education. There's so many different aspects that needs to be incorporated.
Yeah, I can think just offhand, because my head's been wrapped around flooding in Houston lately, but, your example of the Colonia built along the river and in the floodplain areas, this is a population that doesn't trust government, maybe, is afraid to go to government, doesn't want to go ask for money for whether it's a language barrier,
Fiercely
socioeconomic, right, or independence, and they don't want to do that. And so, thinking about how HUD and FEMA get involved is daunting, but very valid questions, and lots of different.
And a necessary step.
But I have to say that HUD has done a lot of, there's a Colonias program, there has been a lot of different binational programs, and HUD has a big presence on the board there. I need to give them credit. They even funded one of my research topics on micro business along the border. Okay, I did like a few years ago with my postdoc money from a hat that used to have more money for this type of projects, and now it's not funded anymore in that area.
Yeah. Anything
So-
else?
So remember, advocate, join the policy the Planners Advocacy Network, and yeah, get that funding up.
So have you seen the survey? Can you, have you?
Yeah, if you guys have looked at the survey and have comments on it, just
Can I
maybe
pick
pass
them
them
up?
up and,
Yeah,
yeah, and thank you all.
yeah, absolutely. Thank y'all for being here.